The night air of the market was bitter and sharp. Frost clung to the metal cages that lined the narrow street. Merchants had already packed their goods and left, but not everything was taken. In the darkest corner, among broken crates and frozen chains, a small alien girl sat curled up, her thin arms wrapped around her body, her skin pale with cold, her breath barely visible in the icy air. No one cared about her anymore. The other captives had been sold to miners, to traders, to cruel men who wanted workers or playthings. But she was too weak, too fragile, and now too close to death. The merchant who once shouted her price had stopped bothering. To him, she was worthless, just another piece of failed merchandise left to freeze in silence. Through the mist and dim lights, a man walked slowly. His boots echoed on the frozen ground, and his coat hung heavy on his shoulders. His name was Ethan, a tired human with rough hands and weary eyes. He was not rich, not powerful, not even very lucky. All he carried with him were a few credits jingling in his pocket, his last credits. He had planned to spend them on food, maybe fuel for his old ship. But as he walked past the cages, his eyes caught the figure shivering in the corner. Ethan stopped. The girl's head was bowed low, her long dark hair stiff with frost, her fingers shaking against the icy bars. She looked no older than a teenager, her frame thin and fragile like glass. When she raised her eyes for just a moment, he saw fear, despair, and something else, a silent plea. It was enough to hold him in place. The merchant noticed his pause and stepped forward with a mocking grin. "You want her? Useless. She won't live the night." The man spat, his voice rough. "Not even worth a meal. Human. Leave her die and save your money." But Ethan did not move away. His eyes stayed fixed on the alien girl. Her lips trembled, her body quivered against the cold, and still she tried to sit upright, as if she refused to break completely. Ethan knew he should walk on. He had nothing left to spare, and his own life was already hard enough. But his chest tightened. In her hopeless eyes, he saw a reflection of himself, the same loneliness, the same struggle. Without thinking, his hand touched the few credits in his pocket. Not enough for both of them, maybe not enough for even him alone, but still he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "How much for the clothes?" The merchant raised an eyebrow, surprised, then laughed loudly. "You don't want the girl, you want clothes for her," he mocked, shaking his head. "She's not even worth it. You'll waste what little you have." But Ethan did not answer. He only held out the credits. The coins clinked softly, and after a moment of greedy hesitation, the merchant snatched them away and tossed a thin, ragged cloak from a pile. Ethan knelt before the cage, his breath fogging in the frozen air. Slowly, he pushed the cloak through the bars. The girl's hands shook as she reached for it, her skin raw and cracked from the cold. She pulled it around her shoulders, hugging the fabric tightly to her chest. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just a whisper carried away by the wind. For the first time that night, warmth touched her skin. Her eyes lifted again, meeting his, and in them burned the smallest spark of life. Ethan felt his throat tighten. The market around him faded. The noise, the cold, the laughter of the merchant, all disappeared. Only the girl remained, her fragile figure wrapped in the cloak he had bought with the last of his credits. He stood slowly, still watching her. His ship waited not far away, but now his heart felt heavier than ever. He had made his choice, and he knew the path ahead would not be simple. Yet as he turned away, the memory of her eyes followed him. They were not the eyes of someone ready to die. They were the eyes of someone who, for the first time in a long time, felt seen. And in that frozen market, with nothing left in his pockets, Ethan realized he had given more than just credits. He had given her a chance, a fragile chance. And maybe, just maybe, that chance would change both their lives forever. Ethan walked away from the merchant's stall, but his steps were heavy. The sound of his boots striking the frozen tiles echoed, like reminders of the choice he had just made. His pocket was empty now, the last of his credits gone, and yet his heart refused to feel regret. The image of the alien girl clutching the cloak was burned into his mind, her eyes shining with faint hope where before there had been none. He stopped near the edge of the market where broken lamps flickered against walls stained with frost. The cold gnawed at him as much as hunger did, but he did not turn back. He could still hear the merchant laughing, telling other buyers what a fool the human was. But Ethan knew better. He had seen something in her that others ignored, a spark of life worth saving. When the night deepened and the crowds thinned, Ethan returned. The cages rattled in the wind, most empty now after a long day of trading. But in the last corner, she remained, the girl who had been left behind. Her head lifted when he approached, as if she could sense it was him. Her lips parted, and this time a sound escaped, a fragile whisper in a language broken but familiar. "Cold," she said, the single word trembling from her mouth. Ethan knelt again, resting his hand against the iron bars. Her voice was weak, but it proved something powerful. She wanted to live. He knew he could not leave her there. Not another hour, not another night. Without credits, without a plan, he was left with only one choice. He had to risk everything. "Can you stand?" he asked softly, and though she struggled, she tried. Her leg wobbled under her, her body swaying, but she clung to the bars and nodded faintly. He looked around the market, but no guards remained. No merchants cared enough to watch the forgotten corner. The cold had chased them all away. Slowly, Ethan forced the lock with a piece of metal scrap, his fingers numb, his breath hard in the frozen air. With a sharp snap, the lock broke, and the cage door creaked open. She stared at him, her wide eyes filled with disbelief, as if freedom itself was a dream too far to touch. Ethan offered his hand, and after a long, shaking pause, she placed her thin fingers into his. Her skin was icy, her pulse faint, but the warmth of his grip steadied her. "Come with me," he said, and her small nod was all the answer he needed. They moved through the deserted alleys, shadows stretching across the walls. Every corner felt dangerous, every sound too loud, but Ethan kept her close. He pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders, shielding her from the wind. People glanced from a distance, some sneering, others whispering. A human carrying an alien girl wrapped in rags was not a sight that went unnoticed. But no one stopped him, no one dared. At the docking bay, his ship waited, an old freighter scarred from years of work. The sable finch was not beautiful, not fast, but it was home. He helped her climb the ramp, her steps slow and clumsy, but filled with determination. Inside, the ship was warmer than the streets, though still worn and dim. He guided her to a seat and draped another blanket over her. For the first time, she let out a deep, trembling breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Ethan crouched beside her, studying her face. She was young, too young to have endured so much suffering. Her skin was marked with frostburn, her lips cracked, her eyes dull but alive. "Why did you not fight back?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. To his surprise, she looked at him, and her voice broke through the silence again. No strength left, no one came. The words stabbed deeper than any blade. She had waited for someone, anyone, but none had cared. Until tonight, Ethan swallowed hard, realizing the weight of the decision he had made. She was no longer a stranger he had pitied. She was now his responsibility. And the galaxy was not kind to those who carried burdens without profit. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the ship as the engines hummed faintly. He had no credits, no supplies, no clear path forward. But he had her, and somehow, that mattered more than everything he had lost. Her small hand clutched the blanket tightly, as if afraid it would be taken away. Her eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion dragging her into sleep. And in that quiet moment, Ethan promised himself, no matter the cost, he would not let her freeze again. The engines of the Sable Finch rumbled low as Ethan guided the ship away from the docking bay. Outside the viewport, the city lights of Sorrel Spire glimmered like cold stars, fading behind them as they drifted into the void. Inside the cabin, Silence pressed down heavier than the hum of machinery. The girl sat wrapped in the ragged cloak, her small frame curled on the seat, her eyes wide with fear and wonder as she studied the human ship around her. Ethan adjusted the controls, his hand steady though his mind was not. He had no plan, no credits, and now a passenger who could bring more trouble than safety. Still, when he looked at her, shivering even under the blanket, he knew he could not have walked away. There was something about her presence, fragile yet stubborn, that stirred a part of him long buried, the part that still believed in doing what was right. She tried to speak, her voice soft and broken. "Where going?" she asked, the words heavy on her tongue, as if language itself was painful. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the attempt. "Somewhere safer than that market," he answered simply. She blinked slowly, as though she was trying to trust the sound of his words. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was filled with small details. The way her fingers clutched the blanket, the way her eyes flicked nervously to the door, the way she flinched whenever the ship groaned against turbulence. Ethan realized she had likely never been in a human vessel before, maybe never left the cages of traders since her capture. The thought tightened his chest. After some time, he rose and fetched a small tin of ration soup from the storage locker. It was his last meal for the night, meant to keep him steady through another long cycle. But he warmed it carefully and set it in front of her. Her eyes widened at the steam, the smell of something more than scraps. She hesitated, staring at him as though afraid it was a trick. "Eat," Ethan urged gently, and after another pause, she lifted the spoon with trembling hands. Her first bite was clumsy, but when the warmth touched her lips, a faint sigh escaped her throat, almost like relief. Ethan sat back, watching her eat slowly, savoring every drop. It struck him how something so small, something so ordinary, could be so extraordinary to her. The galaxy had been cruel to her, cruel enough that a cloak and a bowl of soup felt like miracles. That thought burned deeper into him than hunger ever could. When she was done, she leaned back against the seat, her body weak but her face softer than before. She whispered, "Thank," the words broken but clear. Ethan nodded, though inside his chest he felt something heavy and strange. No one had thanked him in a long time. No one had looked at him the way she did now, with quiet trust, fragile but real. The journey stretched on, the void around them endless. Ethan kept the ship steady, though he noticed how often she glanced at the stars beyond the viewport. Her gaze was filled not only with fear, but with longing, as if those stars reminded her of something lost. Finally, he asked, "What's your name?" She looked at him, her lips parting, then closing again. For a moment he thought she had forgotten, but then she whispered, "Lyra." The name lingered in the cabin, soft but powerful. Ethan repeated it under his breath, "Lyra," and she gave the faintest nod, as if relieved to be remembered. For the first time since he had seen her, Ethan felt the distance between them shrink. She was no longer just a frozen stranger from a cage. She was Lyra, someone with a name, someone with a story yet untold. As the ship drifted farther from the city, a transmission light flickered on the console. Ethan froze, staring at the incoming signal. It was a message from the docks, short and sharp. "Unauthorized departure detected. Cargo missing." His stomach dropped, the words like a blade. They knew she was gone, and they were already searching. Ethan looked at Lyra, who now sat clutching the blanket with wide eyes, sensing his tension. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with danger. He turned back to the controls, his jaw tightening. Whatever he had risked before, the real danger was only beginning. The Sable Finch drifted into the darkness, its old engines humming like tired lungs. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and rust, every wall marked with scratches of years gone by. It was not a ship of comfort, but for Lyra, even this worn vessel felt like a palace compared to the frozen cage she had been left to die in. She sat quietly near the heating vent, wrapped in the blanket Ethan had given her. Her eyes followed every flicker of light, every panel that blinked, every shadow that moved when the ship groaned. Ethan worked at the console, his back straight, his face hard, but his thoughts restless. The transmission from the docks still echoed in his mind. Cargo missing. They were not just words, they were a warning, and he knew what it meant. If the traders realized what he had done, they would not simply laugh at his foolishness. They would come for him, and for her. "Are we safe?" Lyra's voice was a whisper that broke the silence. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes softening when he saw her trembling hands. "For now," he answered, though the truth was not so simple. Safety was never permanent in a galaxy where greed ruled stronger than law. But she needed comfort, not fear, and so he let the lie rest between them. As he checked the fuel reserves, his stomach tightened. The Finch was running low, much lower than he had admitted. Without credits, refueling would be impossible. He had traded survival for kindness, and though he did not regret it, the cost was already pressing against him. Lyra shifted, pulling the cloak tighter, her voice fragile but determined. "You gave all for me," she said slowly, the words breaking but clear enough. Ethan turned to her, shaking his head. "I only gave what I had left, and it wasn't much," he said. Her eyes studied him, and for a moment he thought she might smile, but instead she lowered her head. "No one ever gave," she whispered, as though the thought itself was too heavy. The weight of her words struck him deeper than any insult the traders had thrown. No one had given her anything, not warmth, not food, not kindness until now. Ethan sat across from her, his rough hands folded together. "What happened to you, Lyra?" he asked gently, though he feared the answer. She was silent at first, her gaze fixed on the floor, her breath uneven. Then slowly, she spoke, her voice carrying pieces of sorrow and memory. "My world burned," she whispered. Her fingers clutched the blanket tighter, her knuckles pale. "They came with fire, machines, they took some, left others. I was small, I ran, but they caught me." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell, as if she had forgotten how to cry. Then cage, then market, then cold. Ethan's chest tightened, the story too familiar, too common in a galaxy that fed on conquest and slavery. Yet hearing it from her, so young, so fragile, made the injustice sharper. She had been reduced to nothing more than merchandise, her life measured in credits. And still she had survived, against all odds, until the moment he found her. Before he could respond, the Finch shuddered, a warning light flashing red across the console. Ethan rose quickly, scanning the sensors, his jaw tightening. A small fleet had entered the system, their signals marked with trade guild codes. They were searching, moving from dock to dock, scanning ships. It would only be a matter of time before they turned their eyes toward him. Lyra saw the tension in his face and asked no questions, but her hands gripped the seat. Ethan powered down unnecessary systems, dimming the lights, the ship slipping deeper into shadow. "We'll hide in the debris field," he muttered, guiding the Finch toward a cluster of shattered satellites and abandoned cargo husks that drifted in the black. The ship groaned under the strain, but obeyed, sliding into the graveyard of broken machines. For hours they drifted in silence, the guild's signals growing closer, then fading, then closer again. Every sound felt louder than it should. The creak of the hull, the hiss of the vent, the beating of his own heart. Lyra leaned against the wall, her eyes never leaving him, her trust absolute despite the fear around them. When the signals finally passed, Ethan let out a long breath. They were safe for now, hidden in the shadows of forgotten wreckage. But he knew it was only the beginning. The guild would not stop, not until every credit was squeezed from every life they claimed. And by saving her, he had placed himself on their path. He looked at Lyra, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion, but her gaze still locked on him. In her eyes he saw not only fear, but hope, a fragile flame that refused to die. And in that moment, Ethan realized that his fight was no longer for survival alone. It was for her, and for the chance that kindness might still mean something in a galaxy built on cruelty. The sable finch drifted quietly among the dead hulks of broken satellites. Ethan kept the engines low, afraid that even the smallest signal might give them away. But hiding could only last for so long, and he knew it. The guild was patient, and patience was a weapon just as sharp as any blade. Lyra sat near the viewport, her small hands pressed against the glass. The stars reflected in her eyes, a sea of light against the endless black. To her, they were not only beautiful but haunting, each star a reminder of a place she would never see again. Ethan watched her quietly, his thoughts torn between fear of the guild and the strange pull he felt toward her. The scanner beeped softly, pulling him back. A ship had entered the debris field, moving slowly, methodically, its lights sweeping across the wreckage. Ethan cursed under his breath. "They're searching," he muttered, his hands tightening on the controls. Lyra turned to him, her face pale, her lips trembling as though she could already feel the danger closing in. He cut power further, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The Finch floated like a ghost, hidden among shadows. For a moment, it seemed the guild ship would pass. But then the scanner pulsed again, louder, sharper. More ships had joined the first, forming a net around the field. Ethan's stomach twisted. "They know," he whispered. Lyra's voice shook. "Because me?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes firm. "Because they're greedy, not because of you." But the truth sat heavy on both of them. The guild would not stop, because to them she was profit, and profit was worth chasing through the stars. The first beam of light cut across the Finch's hull. Ethan's breath caught as alarms flickered red across the console. The searchers had found them. "Hold on," he said sharply, slamming the controls forward. The Finch roared to life, its old engines screaming as the ship burst from the cover of wreckage. The guild ships reacted instantly, their engines flaring as they closed in. Bolts of plasma streaked across the void, glowing trails cutting past the Finch's hull. The ship shuddered violently, warning lights screaming. Lyra clung to her seat, her eyes wide, her body shaking. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing the ship through the narrow gaps between drifting debris. The Finch groaned but obeyed, twisting and diving, every movement a gamble. "Why chase so hard?" Lyra cried over the noise. "Because to them you're not a person, you're property," Ethan shouted back. His words cut deeper than any weapon, but Lyra did not look away. Her eyes filled with something beyond fear, anger, sorrow, defiance all at once. The guild ships tightened their net, 3 of them now, boxing the Finch into a deadly corner. Ethan slammed a lever, releasing a burst of fuel vapor from the rear vents. The plasma bolts struck the cloud, igniting it in a sudden blaze. The explosion shook the field, blinding the pursuers for a moment. Ethan dove the Finch downward, engines howling as he forced every ounce of speed from the dying ship. But the chase was not over. One of the guild ships broke free of the blast, its sleek frame gliding after them with relentless precision. The Finch rattled under fire, panels sparking, alarms screaming. Ethan's jaw clenched as he fought the controls. He knew the Finch could not outrun them forever, not in this condition. Beside him, Lyra pressed her hands against the console, her eyes closed tight. Strange symbols glowed faintly across her skin, shimmering like starlight. Ethan turned in shock, but before he could speak, the ship's systems flickered. The Finch's sensors lit up with bursts of alien code, streaming faster than Ethan could read. Lyra whispered words in a language he did not know, her voice trembling but steady. Suddenly the Finch lurched forward with a burst of speed it should not have had. The engines, once groaning, now roared like new, propelled by something beyond human engineering. The pursuing guild ship faltered, struggling to match the sudden acceleration. Ethan stared at her, astonished. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Lyra's eyes opened, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Helping," she whispered, her voice almost a promise. For the first time since the chase began, hope sparked in Ethan's chest. Together they had broken through the net, slipping past the guild ships into the open void. The scanners beeped frantically, signals still chasing, but distant now. Ethan exhaled hard, his hands shaking as he steadied the controls. Lyra slumped in her seat, pale and weak, but still alive. Ethan looked at her, realization settling over him. She was not only a survivor, not only a victim, she carried something hidden, something powerful. And the guild would hunt her harder than ever if they discovered it. The chase was not finished. It was only beginning. The Sable Finch drifted into the dark stretch of space, its engines panting after the burst of unnatural speed. Ethan's hands were still tight on the controls, his breath ragged, his mind racing with questions. He turned to Lyra, who now leaned weakly against the seat, her skin pale and her eyelids heavy. "What did you do back there?" he asked, his voice rough but low. She opened her eyes slowly, faint light still shimmering in them like dying embers. "My people, we were not only farmers," she whispered, each word pulling effort from her frail body. "We carried knowledge deep inside. Old machines listen when we speak." Ethan frowned, trying to grasp her meaning, but the evidence was in front of him. The Finch, a ship that should have broken apart under such strain, had surged forward with new strength when she touched it. Somehow she had awakened systems buried or forgotten. It was impossible by human standards, but nothing about her survival had been ordinary. Before he could ask more, the scanner pulsed again, harsh and steady. The guild ships had not given up, their signals growing closer with each second. Ethan cursed under his breath. "They won't stop," he muttered. "Not until they have you back in chains." Lyra's hands tightened around the blanket, her jaw trembling, but her voice was steady. "Then we fight." Ethan looked at her in surprise, seeing not only fear in her eyes, but a fire that had been missing before. She was tired, broken, fragile, yet she refused to surrender. Something inside him shifted at that. For years he had drifted through life, surviving but not living, and now, sitting beside him, was someone who had lost everything but still wanted to fight. It was enough to make him believe again. The guild ships appeared on the edge of the viewport, sleek shadows cutting across the stars. Their weapons flared, plasma bolts streaking toward the Finch. Ethan gripped the controls, weaving the ship between blasts, sparks flying across the panels. The hull screamed, metal groaning, but they held together. Lyra leaned forward, pressing her palm against the console once more, her eyes glowing brighter. The systems flickered alive, lights dancing across the boards as if the ship itself had woken from a long sleep. The Finch responded like never before, twisting and rolling with a grace Ethan had never imagined it could hold. The old freighter moved like a predator, darting between shots, diving through gaps that should have been impossible. Ethan laughed once, short and wild, as adrenaline surged through his veins. "You're making her fly like a warship," he shouted over the alarms. Lyra's voice was soft but steady. "She listens to me." The guild ships regrouped, circling like wolves, their fire raining harder. One struck the Finch's side, rattling the cabin, alarms shrieking red. Ethan swore, fighting to stabilize. But Lyra closed her eyes, murmuring words in her lost tongue. The damage alerts faded, systems patched themselves, panels glowed with renewed strength. The ship was repairing itself under her touch. Ethan could hardly believe what he was seeing. She was not just guiding the ship. She was merging with it, binding her life force to the machine. But he saw the cost, too. The way her body trembled, the sweat glistening on her forehead, the weakness stealing her strength with every second she pushed. "You'll burn yourself out," Ethan growled. Lyra shook her head, her eyes fierce despite her fragile frame. "Better to burn than freeze," she whispered. With a sudden surge, the Finch spun on its axis, unleashing a burst of redirected energy that flashed across the void. The nearest guild ship veered hard, colliding with a drifting chunk of debris, exploding in a blaze of fire and twisted steel. The other two ships pulled back briefly, regrouping, cautious now. Ethan steadied his breathing, his heart hammering in his chest. They had destroyed one, against all odds, but the fight was not done. The guild was never satisfied with losing. They would come back, stronger and angrier. Ethan turned to Lyra, her body shaking, but her eyes still locked on him with determination. For a moment, the cabin was filled with silence, broken only by the hum of the engines. He reached over, placing a rough hand gently on hers. "We'll make it," he said, his voice a vow as much as a promise. Lyra's lips curved faintly, a fragile smile breaking through her exhaustion. "With you," she whispered, "I believe." The scanner pulsed again, new signals approaching, larger than before. The battle was far from over. But in that dim, battered cabin, Ethan and Lyra sat side by side. No longer just a human and a broken captive. They were allies, bound by fire, fate, and a promise not to surrender. And together, against all odds, they would stand. The scanner lights glowed across the control board, each pulse a reminder that danger was still close. Ethan's knuckles were white on the controls, his jaw tight as he steered the Sable Finch through the dark. The guild ships were regrouping, more signals flashing on the edges of the screen. They were not done, not by a long shot. Lyra sat beside him, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling from the strain of binding herself to the ship. Her strength was fading, but her eyes still burned with quiet fire. She had already given more than Ethan could have asked, yet she pushed herself forward, refusing to collapse. Ethan glanced at her and felt a weight in his chest, a mix of fear and admiration. She was fragile, yes, but inside her was a resilience stronger than any steel. The guild ships closed in, surrounding them once more. Ethan's mind raced, searching for any way out. The Finch could not outfight them forever, not even with Lyra's power guiding it. Then his eyes caught something on the edge of the star map. A drift zone, a field of unstable wormhole fractures. Most pilots avoided it, calling it a graveyard of lost ships. But to Ethan, it looked like their only chance. "We're going in," he said sharply. Lyra turned her head weakly, confusion flickering across her face. "It's dangerous," she whispered. "More dangerous than staying here." Ethan shot back, his hands already moving over the controls. She stared at him for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod, placing her hand on the console once more. Together they dove toward the glowing ripples of fractured space. The Finch shuddered as the first wave of gravitational distortion hit. The stars outside twisted, bending like liquid glass. An alarm screamed across the cabin. Ethan fought the controls with everything he had, his teeth clenched. Lyra whispered in her ancient tongue, her voice a thread of calm weaving through the chaos. The Finch responded, steadier now, listening to both of them, a union of human instinct and alien will. The guild ships hesitated at the edge of the drift zone. One followed recklessly, vanishing in a flash of light as the unstable rift swallowed it whole. The others pulled back, unwilling to risk their precious cargo hunters in such a deadly place. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his eyes locked on the twisting horizon ahead. They were not safe yet, but the guild would not follow deeper. Hours passed like years as they guided the Finch through the fractured zone. Finally, the distortions thinned, the stars straightened, and the hum of the ship softened into calm. Silence filled the cabin, heavy but peaceful. Ethan leaned back, exhausted, his eyes closing for a moment. When he looked at Lyra, she was watching him, her small face pale, but her eyes steady. "You saved us," he said quietly. Lyra shook her head, her voice soft. "We saved each other." Ethan stared at her, and in that moment he understood. He had thought he had given away his last credits, thought he had lost everything when he chose to buy her a cloak instead of food. But he had gained something far greater, a companion who had turned his dying freighter into a ship of hope. The Finch was scarred. Their supplies were low, their future uncertain. But when Ethan looked at Lyra, He no longer felt the emptiness of drifting alone. She leaned closer, her small hand resting over his, her eyes shining faintly in the cabin light. "No more cages," she whispered. "No more cages," he echoed, the vow sealing itself between them like steel. Outside, the stars stretched endless and bright. The galaxy was still cruel, still filled with guilds and slavers and hunters. But now, for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was moving towards something instead of just away from it. Lyra sat beside him, alive, free, and no longer forgotten. Together they had survived, against all odds, and together they would carve a new path. Ethan's hand tightened on the controls, his voice low but steady. "Where to now?" Lyra's lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes glimmering as she looked at the stars. "Anywhere," she said, "as long as not alone." And so the sable finch sailed into the unknown, carrying not just a man and an alien girl, but a bond born from sacrifice, courage, and the simple act of choosing kindness in a galaxy that had forgotten it. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one truth was clear. He thought he had spent his last credits, but in truth, he had bought a new beginning for both of them.